and forgetting. And I'm simply going to introduce the speakers and the title of their paper. Now, we're also under instruction to have a minute question and answer session at the end of this, because we are running considerably behind time, but I think everybody will be okay with that. So, collections in the Museum of Anthropology, University of Cambridge. And the title of Rachel's paper is Gifts and Loot, Entangled and Contradictory Histories of Irish Collecting.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone's still awake. It's always tricky having the last session. So I'd also like to join in thanking the conference organisers for inviting me to here. It's been fabulous to see so many people and catch up with so many as well. And I've been learning an awful lot this morning. It's been fabulous. So one of the sort of main impediments to communities engaging with their historic collections, as we've heard a lot this morning, has been that museums often lack this documentation regarding the origins of their collections. These issues were clearly highlighted in the 2018 report by Felouine Sarr and Benedictine Savoy, as well as by Gay and multiple other speakers today. And my paper, I hope, will explore some of the nuances and stories behind the different collecting theatres. Colonial collecting was nuanced and often contradictory. Collectors acquired material during very violent conflicts, but they were also given material as gifts and acquired others in commercial transactions. These histories of conflict and exchange offer a platform to debate and represent and start a process of collaboration with Indigenous communities and colleagues on the futures of these collections. But as Audrey and Gay and others have been mentioning, just because these materials were purchased in these commercial transactions doesn't mean that the circumstances and the unequal power dynamics relating to these should not be investigated further. Despite the main ethnographic gallery in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin closing in the 1970s, material has travelled internationally. Publications by Bill Hart on the African collections way back in 1994, sorry Bill, the late Stella Cherry on the modern, obviously on the Pacific by Aoife O'Brien, whose paper is following mine, other work by myself and the oncoming work by the Collecting the West team. These have offered glimpses of these histories. However, to the public in Ireland and the communities represented by the collections, they remain pretty much unknown. The museum's long-term plans to redisplay and represent the collection meant that in 2016 they asked me to write an overview of the collections within its colonial context. Now I have to confess, 2016 is a bit of a lifetime ago now. I completed a global pandemic and also a full-time job in Cambridge, but they will come out this year. So Entangled Histories will be published later this year, and the entangled element refers not only to Nicholas Thomas's idea of engagement and entanglement, but the deeply entangled nature of Ireland's own colonial histories and the duality of men and women who were both colonised and colonisers. Now, Roger Casement is perhaps, well, I think I've got my slides in the wrong order, there we go. Roger Casement is perhaps the most well-known of Irish collectors whose life reflects this dichotomy. Initially a commercial agent and a colonial administrator, he should benefit Irish rather than English institutions, a fervour that grew in tandem with his nationalism, and I'm very much looking forward to Angus's paper on this tomorrow. No, I'm going in the wrong direction. Come on. There we go. So one of the things I wanted to touch on today is that there have been various mentions of the sort of Benin collections and the restitution and return of this material, and I wanted to highlight some of the issues and the work that's been going on in Dublin relating to these collections. In April 2021, just last year, the National Museum of Ireland committed to a restitution process of material from the Kingdom of Benin looted during the British expedition to Benin in 1897. 11 of these bronzes, used on ancestral altars or as ceremonial regalia, were bought from the English dealer William Webster. He bought very widely from expedition members and sales and became the pre-eminent dealer of looted Benin material. However, Like the majority of museums with colonial collections, the provenance of the other material is less clear, and the exact circumstances of their collection and the routes they took to the museum weren't recorded. There was very little information in the museum's archives and registers on the collector of 9 other Benin pieces, which were sold to the museum in the early 1900s, other than the fact they were acquired on the 1897 expedition. My researchers revealed that the vendor was Thomas Graham, Honorary Secretary of the Irish National League. He campaigned for Home Rule in Ireland, but like many others, his family took advantage of the opportunities offered by emigration and imperial expansion. The museum displays of Benin trophies legitimised British corporate and militant colonialism, but these were also a father's memorial to his son. Charles Graham had been an assistant agent for the Liverpool merchant of James Pinnock in Sapele, a town and trading centre on the Benin River, and he died there in 1899. His effects were sent home to his father. It's still not clear how Graham acquired this small but significant group of objects. Did he take part in the expedition to sack the palace? Did he acquire them from friends and traders on the returning expedition? Or were they part of material that circulated later in the region amongst traders, both European and African? To the Oba, the leader of the Edo people, and other Nigerian members of the Benin Dialogue Group, the origin of these religious artefacts and chiefly possessions in the palace of Oba Ovonwawan and their looting during the expedition is more important than the convoluted routes they took to Ireland. Bounce back again, and there we go. So my work with the communities in Cambridge has continually emphasised the value of collectors' biographical information. Who were they? Why were they there? And what circumstances surrounded their collection? The large collection of Captain, later Lieutenant Colonel, Wilfred Bennett David Houston demonstrates some of the complexities of these entangled colonial relationships and the varied and contradictory collecting practices. Between 1895 and 1910, he deposited over 900 objects collected during his military and colonial service in West Africa. Although the majority of the material is from groups in present-day Ghana, it crosses transnational borders and includes material from cross-border communities. So you can see here in Bonduku in the Côte d'Ivoire in the west, and also Burkina Faso in the north on the borders of what was French Sudan. It's just directly above the area in sort of orange-marked Northern Territories. He was the second son of Reverend Bennett Clear Davidson from Cork. He adopted the Davidson in 1879 as part of his wife's inheritance of lands in Tyrone. Davidson Houston joined the Royal Dublin Fusiliers in 1887, aged just 17. And he was continuing a tradition on both his mother's family and potentially his father's of military service. From 1894 to 1905, he served in West Africa and was an important advisor on local affairs to the new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, and records suggest he maintained good relationships with local people. His wide-ranging collection includes material from multiple groups and includes weapons, clothing, personal ornaments, furniture, including a rather large door, as well as horse equipment, slave-related material, and material relating to gold dust. It's mainly provenance to really broad cultural regions rather than specific places, and the register entries give no indication of dates or where they were acquired. Several handwritten notes accompany some brassware indicate a remarkable awareness and detailed knowledge of Asante history, of empire building and metal casting styles and techniques and influences. Unfortunately, there are no details on his informants. The wand-worn register still require much investigating. The stick here is the head of a walking stick on the right, is decorated with a style. While Asante men did use walking sticks, this would have been created especially for a European market. Akwaaba figures are usually carried by children. Its creation reflects the commoditisation and adaptation of traditional art forms in a new colonial economy. Davidson Houston may also have commissioned the creation of a gold weight, as a handwritten note records it was copied from a charm worn by an unnamed war captain in the reign of Asante Osioyo Okoto, who ruled from 1824 to 1834, although who held the original charm is not noted. Several masks also appeared unused. The blackened mask on the right here is repaired in several places. You can probably just see the string around the horn on the top, indicating a long and valued use. However, the mask in the centre doesn't show any signs of wear at all. There's no abrasions, marks from sweat, body oils, or methods to attach it to the head. Both masks are recorded from Jaman country, that is the region surrounding Bonduku in the present-day Côte d'Ivoire, and you can just see it here in the sort of centre region there. So it's across the border now, but at the time was just outside the Asante Empire. These masks and several others were collected in 1896 while on a diplomatic mission to conclude trade agreements with several chiefs within the region's area. The expedition was very much welcomed and gifted with food and presents, as these leaders wanted alliances with the British and protection from the incursions of Samori Touré, an Islamic leader and empire builder who resisted French colonialism. These gifts may explain some of the items that show little evidence of use. Was the mask gifted before it was danced, or was it commissioned following a masquerade the party may have seen? The collecting and gifting on this expedition seems to have been quite extensive, as similar Lobi stools, a group from further north, potentially on the border of Burkina Faso and what was the Northern Territory, the similar stools in the British Museum, and also masks, including 2 large plank masks, were also collected by David Houston's colleague, the map maker on the expedition, the Englishman Cecil Armitage, which are now in the British Museum. However, a lack of use wear doesn't always indicate that an object was unused or made for sale. This chiefly woman's stool here has silver mounts and crisp painted designs on the base. Among the Asante people in Ghana, as with other people in West Africa, a chief's position is confirmed through a process of installment, similar to a coronation. Stools are publicly displayed and paraded, but not usually sat on in public, although queen mothers are generally the exception. Oops. Anyway, the stools, they were by hides or textiles and went on display in a special stool house. They rarely come in contact with the ground. The previous Asanteni, you can see here on the right, left, the paramount chief of the Asante nation, Tumfu Opoku Ware II, is shown here with a golden stool. Decorated with gold mounts, it rests on its own throne and is never sat on. It's the sacred symbol of the Asante and is considered to house the soul of the Asante nation. And also, just keep an eye out for these similar gold swords you see held by his attendants. It's likely that the stool and other material noted as Prempeh's palace, such as 2 brass-studded Asapim chairs and these 3 Afena, gold-handled state swords, were seized in 1896 during the army's sanctioned looting of the royal palace in the city of Kumasi. Davis and Houston commanded the advance guard of the Second Ashanti Expedition in the 4th Anglo-Ashanti War, supported by West African troops, the Gold Coast Hausa, and West Indian regiments. The Asante king, or rather the properly known as the Asanteni Otumfu Nana Prempeh I, was deposed and exiled. A group of 6 open-work paddles, noted only as from Benin, also require further investigation. These may be used by priests to protect the Oba and chase away evil. Although similar paddle expedition are held in the Pitteris Museum in Oxford and the Horniman, any connection to the expedition remains to be determined. Davis and Houston did require several items from areas he's not known to have visited, such as a Pemba figure from the coastal region of Central Africa. An old handwritten exhibition label records that Davis and Houston was also presented with a textile by Prempeh himself. This here is a large stamped and decorated adinkra cloth, which would have been worn wrapped around the body and is stamped with the Aban pattern, a design reserved for the Asanteni. A gift of material that has been in contact with the royal and divine physical person of the Asantini implies some form of significant personal or diplomatic connections. However, I've recently discovered that Davis and Houston was Prempeh's, and I quote, custodian, when he was arrested in Kumasi and taken to the Cape Coast Castle in 1896. Was the cloth an earlier gift to an influential colonial officer by an Asante leader, one who was negotiating alliances to maintain his sovereignty, or was it given to his jailer after the attack on Kumasi? This is likely to be one of the gifts which is loaded with unseen messages and inequalities. To paraphrase the French sociologist Marcel Mauss, there's no such thing as a free gift. Gifts are rather weighed down with obligations and expectations of reciprocity. Examples of these are found across the collections. I'm moving now swiftly across the Pacific, so I hope you'll bear with me. From some of the first 18th century encounters with Europeans, influential Pacific Islanders gifted material to explorers and colonial elites to draw them into networks of reciprocal relationships. Maori tonga, or ancestral treasures, such as flax cloaks and weapons, were given to the ship's crews, led by James Cook in the late 18th century. Unfortunately, the reciprocal nature of these gifts was rarely understood. Are they then gifts in that same sense? The politician Sir Thomas Grattan Esmond visited Tonga and Samoa in 1890 during his fundraising tour for the Irish National Party. King George Tupu I of Tonga presented him with a diplomatic and very chiefly gift of a root made from the root of the kava plant, a pepper-like plant. This gift recognised Esmond's political status, but also promoted Tonga as an independent nation to Queen Victoria, if one were caught between the imperial machinations of Germany and Great Britain. Competition for the Samoan kingship was also driven by the external interests of Germany and Great Britain. And on his return to Ireland, Esmond went on to promote Samoan independence, possibly seeing a reflection of his own struggles for political autonomy. Arthur Mahaffey, a colonial officer whose father was the provost at Trinity College in Dublin, whose collections are going to be ably explored by IFOM following just was also presented gifts by influential Samoans, potentially seeking his support in these leadership contexts. Bouncing back to Africa. Another diplomatic gift, potentially one which emphasised the status of the donor, may also be a man's cotton riga, or a robe of honour, embroidered with Islamic designs, which was given to the Royal Navy surgeon, Francis William Davis, the medical officer in the 1857-59 Niger River expedition. It was given possibly by the emir of the Nupe, Etsuma Sabe. So these gifts are emerging slowly through archival research, but we do need to see a lot more provenance research on them. But like the walking stick, many items were made for sale for non-local patrons as artists responded creatively to a new colonial market. In Haida Gwaii, an island off British Columbia, argillite, a soft shale, it's very easily carved, was made into hybrid souvenirs for sailors in the maritime fur trade, travellers as well as museum collectors. These pipes, the one on the left here, which actually can't be smoked, and a bowl by the celebrated Haida artist here on the right, Charles Edenshaw, both incorporate a ritual that ensured oral histories continued to be told. In Benin, the Metal Casters Guild also created new works for a non-royal audience. I'm afraid I don't have any slides of these. They came out very badly a few years ago. But 2 metal figures were also collected by the Reverend Father William Lumley, who in 1928 became the first missionary from Benin in the Irish province of the Royal Society of African Missions. Today, as the museum is starting to engage with Edo leaders, as well as the National Monuments and Museums Commission in Nigeria, through the Digital Benin project on the future of Benin material. The wider Irish legacy also forms part of this debate. This is very different to the repatriation in 1974 of the beaded hide coat confiscated at the arrest of Métis rebel and leader Louis Réal. This was transferred to the Museum of Man, now the Canadian Museum of Civilization, in 1974, I think I said. The then director, A.T. Lucas, argued that the coat was a personal relic and it had only the remotest relevance to Irish history. At the time, there was no recognition of the uncomfortable histories of colonial dispossession, Irish immigration and military officers, embodied by the collector, the Mountie Corporal Harry Green. Lucas was a very keen supporter of the UNESCO Convention, which provided a framework to prevent the export of cultural property, but also promoted return and restitution. Lucas believed that ethnographic material worldwide should be repatriated to its countries of origin, and compared it to the pillage of Irish heritage. Now, we've discussed in various forms how physical restitution is only one option. Part of the discussions with the NMCM is that how to confirm this legal transfer of title, and whether works will return physically or whether they will stay in Europe. And this is something that is being led by the Nigerian groups, and I think it's important. This is how we're starting to move forward. We're listening very much rather than invoking our own ideas on what should happen to this material. My book is only the first stage in a longer process. More research is in collaboration with and led by communities of origin is needed. To decolonise our practices requires a fundamental shift in institutional processes and ways of thinking about legal, ethical and traditional forms of ownership, as well as notions of care, and should recentre the presence of the ancestral past in the present. It raises questions of how to care for collections, issues of returning material to their ancestral cultural owners or to the current nation state, an issue very central to the return of Benin material. Museum ideas of preservation may also run counter to indigenous concepts of care. Should they be placed in a glass case, be used, or eventually allowed to decay? A relationship approach that refocuses on specific cultural landscapes, informed by both Irish and indigenous scholarship, can acknowledge these diverse meanings and relationships that cultural heritage had and continues to have with people and land in the past and the present. But collaboratively, museums can address histories of both conflict and friendship and offer a platform to debate Irish colonial legacies with Indigenous museums, artists and academics, as well as the Irish audiences, on the past and futures of these collections. Only then can they be fully re-entangled and present, and I'm using the phrase re-entangled by my colleague Paul Bassou. I'll end with a note about the possibilities of collaboration. In 2015, I was rummaging in a box and I found a physically nondescript tube of bamboo labelled as an African quiver. However, I recognised it as a Tongan musical instrument known as a stamping tube from an illustration drawn about 200 years ago by Irish teenager Henry Kenelm Digby. What began by asking Pacific Friends questions on social media about these morphed into a production process of experimentation and comparisons with other stamping tubes, also previously misidentified as quivers. Short sounds of newly created stamping tubes were heard in the Tongan Islands after a 200-year hiatus. Let's make more things like this happen. Thank you very much.